Welcome all. Thank you for joining us, the Atlantic Council Syria project for this timely event, the 1 year on assessing the February 6th earthquake response in Syria. I want to welcome those who are joining us here in the United States, in Europe, or over in the region in Turkey and Syria. Over a year ago, on the early morning of February 6, 2023, a massive earthquake hit southern Turkey and northwest Syria, resulting in the destruction of tens of villages and towns and the displacement of over 2 million people inside northwest Syria alone. Local and international organizations has been struggling with the response in the aftermath of the earthquake. We've seen delays in delivering aid, delays in the sending of recovery teams. But 1 year after, as we imagined that the response would slow down, that the situation would get better, local communities and local humanitarian actors continue to struggle in the response to the earthquake. Not only because of the decrease to humanitarian funding, not only because of the lack of attention for the situation in northwest Syria as tension rise across the region in the Middle East, but also because military attacks continue to target areas of northern Aleppo and Idlib province by the Assad regime and their Iranian and Russian allies. To discuss this today, I'm honored to be joined by Raed Saleh, the head of the White Helmets, the Syria Civil Defense, by Dr. Amani Qaddour, the Executive Director of Syria Relief and Development, a local Syrian organization working in different areas of public health, of humanitarian response in northwest Syria and other communities. And I'm also, last but not least, honored to be joined by Alex Mahoney, the Division Chief for Middle East and the Levant at the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. Before we start, I want to present this video produced by the White Helmets on the earthquake and the response and what we've been missing in the last year.
February 6th was a day like no other. The catastrophic earthquake that struck northern Syria left entire cities and towns unrecognizable as buildings were leveled to the floor. The devastation that struck civilian homes, schools, hospitals, and roads in the aftermath of the catastrophic earthquake demanded a swift and urgent plan to address the crisis. And so the White Helmets crafted a comprehensive response plan, prioritizing the most urgent needs for civilians in northwestern Syria. Following the completion of the first phase, which encompassed search and rescue operations, provision of temporary shelter for affected civilians, and medical care for the injured, the second phase was launched, during which the White Helmets initiated the first step towards revitalizing the affected regions by reopening over 200 kilometers of roads. Subsequently, the third phase began, encompassing the removal of debris and the demolition of structurally compromised buildings, all executed in accordance with engineering standards. These actions were critical in preparing for the restoration of infrastructure that would support a dignified life for the residents. Once the White Helmets had addressed the most urgent tasks, our teams developed various project initiatives to help in the recovery and rehabilitation of local communities. A significant rehabilitation project was undertaken in the Kafr Karmin camps to serve 7,000 homes by extending clean water networks for approximately 50,000 meters and sewage networks for approximately 90,000 meters, in addition to implementing similar sanitation projects in other various camps and villages. The White Helmets launched projects to rehabilitate and pave vital roads. These included the Sarmada Kafr Daryan Road, a critical route connecting western Idlib to the Bab al-Hawa border crossing, as well as the Al-Amoud Road in the city of Sarmada, the third bridge road in Afrin, and the Afrin Kafr Jannah Road, a pivotal route linking Afrin to the northern cities of Aleppo. Additional projects were initiated to rebuild what the earthquake had laid to waste. This encompassed the rehabilitation and construction of mosques, schools, and healthcare facilities. While our teams were dedicated to recovering from the aftermath of the earthquake disaster, they continued simultaneously to meet the needs of their people. They responded to forest fires that threatened the environment, local residents, and the displaced populations in camps. Water rescue teams were present at water bodies to provide safety and rescue operations. UXO teams also continued to clear unexploded war remnants that threatened lives and hindered agricultural activities. Medical teams helped people access healthcare facilities, while awareness teams promoted community awareness for proper disaster response and disease prevention. Women and family health centers played a pivotal role in providing first aid, maternal care, and healthcare for children and the elderly. Despite the tragedy that struck Syrians living in northwest Syria, attacks by the Assad regime and Russia persisted. Our teams responded to hundreds of attacks targeting residential areas, public facilities, and schools, resulting in the loss of dozens of innocent lives, primarily children. These attacks jeopardized livelihoods, depriving people of their sources of income and causing new waves of displacement, posing a significant obstacle to recovery and the healing process.
Right, after this video, I want to start with you. And actually, before that, a reminder to our audience, if you have any question at any point, please go to askac.org. That is askac.org to post any question you have. But allow me to start with you. It's been a year since the earthquake. As I said, circumstances are not getting better. There are increased tensions in northwest Syria. By the increased bombardment by the Assad regime, Russia and Iran across Northwest. We're seeing a slash of humanitarian funding for the humanitarian sector in Syria by about 30 to 40% since the beginning of this year. And again, the overall economic situation is not really getting any better. 1 year on, how do you really assess the recovery process of communities impacted by the earthquake in northwest Syria? And what do those communities look like today?
حقيقة يعني كان عام أولا شكرا لك قتيبة وللسادة.
First of all, thank you, Qutayba, and thank you, everybody, whoever is attending this webinar to discuss this important event that has changed the lives of thousands of Syrians in the aftermath of 13 years of the war earthquake, so to speak, of the regime, and now they're faced with a natural earthquake and this disaster. So my assessment of the first stages of recovery, I dare say that we are still at the very beginning of the recovery stages. We have not gone any long way yet because of so many obstacles that and challenges that prevent us from achieving anything because of the infrastructure that has already been so bad and that has been under bombardment and under shelling for over a decade already. Let me give you a small example. So we can say that one of the schools in Aleppo, let's say, has rehabilitated following the earthquake. But after this school has been rehabilitated, the Syrian regime shells or bombs this school, this very school, just a few months later. So recovery from the earthquake is still at its infancy. Yes, we are working hard. We are working hard with our partners from different organizations, Syrian organizations that are active in North West Syria to go ahead and develop programs and projects that help the affected people and the civilians to forget about the regime and to forget about the earthquake and get better. However, what we see on the ground and the obstacles we face on the ground are making us go very slow. And still, there are so many things that kind of prevent us from providing or conveying the humanitarian aid to the Syrian people directly and implementing any project per se. Also, the circumstances and the conditions in the Middle East area have also affected the recovery issue and also affected the funding in northwest Syria because this has an impact on slowing down all implementation of current projects and future projects. I believe we need more and more years in order to recover from the earthquake, let alone the other disasters that the Syrian people have been experiencing so far. And it goes without saying that the attacks that have been ongoing for the last 6 months have had a very negative impact on the already affected areas. In October, those attacks reached their peak. The area has not seen such a volume of attacks, particularly since October of last year until the end of the year, where about 1,350 targets or attacks targeting 188 locations. About 177 people were martyred, including dozens of children and women. Almost 1,000 were taken to hospitals, including 238 children and 99 women. And as I mentioned, this started in Ab, and its peak was in August, and its peak was in October with the beginning of the military operations, the Israeli operations in Gaza. And since then, or like the most important figures is that out of these targets, there were also 31 schools and 14 camps and 12 markets were targeted in the attacks, which means that the attacks were targeting civilian people to kill the civilians, and kill hope. Right after those people thought that they had started to recover and gradually go back to normal life and take a breath from all the experiences that they have been and the conditions they have been under, they started sending their children back to school and started their new lives. Only then these attacks came from the side of the regime with new methods of attacks that are targeting schools, targeting markets. When we talk about targeting 31 schools, this is a huge number. This is a huge figure. Without nobody made any statements about that by the United Nations, even the UNICEF. Most of those schools that were targeted are basically financed and funded by the UNICEF, who showed no reaction. So what we want to say here is that all of those attacks, as I mentioned a year before in a press conference, Syrians have not been did not experience an earthquake on the 6th of February, and the Syrians have already been suffering from the actual earthquake for 12 years, and this last disaster of earthquake came only to as a further further state of suffering to the people in Syria, in Aleppo, in the Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, Idlib, and other places in Syria. And we can't hear you, Qutaiba. Maybe you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm saying it's definitely an earthquake on top of a long existing earthquake, as you mentioned, right? It's one that has been going on for over 12 years now. I want to move on to Amani also to look at a different side of the issue at hand. The earthquake itself didn't only hit communities in Syria, it definitely also hit communities in Turkey. But not only that, it had actually Syrian communities who sought refuge in Turkey. Estimates put around 11,000 Syrians were the victims of the earthquake in Turkey, around a third of those who were impacted in those communities. Amani, if I can move to you, looking at the impact of the earthquake on Syrian communities in Turkey, how has been the recovery process for those communities? Do they look even the same after 12 years? And also, if we want to look at long-term impact of the earthquake in general, what do you think is specifically the humanitarian long-term impact of the earthquake on those communities, both Syrian communities in Turkey, but also those in northwest Syria?
Sure. Thanks, Qutaiba, for having me. And I also just want to start by thanking the Atlantic Council and the White Helmets for having me today alongside Raed and Alex. Maybe before I start, I also just want to pay tribute to all of those who lost their lives in both Turkey and Syria last year during the earthquakes, loved ones, family members, colleagues, and I really want to commend the work of all of the incredible aid workers and organizations that responded in the aftermath, including my own colleagues at SRD, including obviously the White Helmets and their incredible life-saving search and rescue efforts. So Qutaiba, maybe I'll answer your question sort of in reverse. I'll start with sort of centering it on Syria, just to underscore some of the points that Raed just went through, and maybe situating it in the wider response for Northwest, not just specific to the earthquake, since a lot of these humanitarian implications obviously don't exist in a vacuum. I'm going to try to do my best not to be so grim, but really the situation from 1 year ago, and Raed highlighted a lot of this, really shows us that across nearly every single sector, whether it's health, whether it's shelter, whether it's education, including food, there are massive gaps that exist right now. In terms of the humanitarian needs, the numbers have increased. For example, just 1 year from 2023 to 2024, we went from 15.3 million people in need to 16.7 million in need this year in 2024. And we know that things like the Humanitarian Response Plan or the HRP is only funded about 35% for this upcoming year. And in the backdrop, of course, we know that 2024, and as Qutaiba highlighted this as well, we're looking at massive increases, 40 to 50%, honestly, for some of the programs that may be completely eliminated at this point. So the outlook isn't really a positive one. And with this increase in needs at the same time as dramatic funding, at the same time as donor fatigue, obviously with good reason, with a lot of other concurrent crises being supported right now, this just still doesn't eliminate some of the needs in Syria. In terms of shelter, about 2/3 of the population is displaced in the Northwest. 1 million of them still reside in IDP camps, informal settlements, and within some of these displacement camps, about half of them are actually informal, meaning they don't have access to formalized services. And then from those in the earthquake 1 year later, we're looking at closer to 150,000 that are still impacted and don't have viable shelter solutions. And some are still residing in collective centers and some of the makeshift settlements. And we know that with winter, this past winter, and including the one we're in right now, and even summer, the impact of climate shocks has meant more flooding. It's meant heat waves. We saw deadly heat waves last summer. Raed emphasized a really important point, which was education, not only physical damage to schools in the aftermath of the earthquake, but the escalation of hostilities since October that have continued. 31 schools being targeted, 31 schools. Imagine in the US, 31 schools being targeted. What would we be thinking? Could we even fathom that number? That means over 500,000 children are out of school right now in the Northwest. This, of course, sort of is with the backdrop of major inflation across the country, particularly in the Northwest, food shortages, WFP massive cuts going from 5 million people being supported to 1 million people being supported, essentially only 20% of what was previously communities that were receiving food aid before. That's not an insignificant number. And then just to look back a bit in terms of the great deal of support that came in after the earthquake and massive humanitarian funding, I would say, within a few months, I would say by summertime, it was very clear these resources were dwindling. And obviously a lot of the gains, particularly, I say the terms loosely, but early recovery gains that were made before the earthquake were simply lost. It was back at square one. And this is where situating the needs is so important, especially since so many of the interventions early on, we were constantly told to target earthquake-only needs. And I think that was one of the most challenging aspects of our work, to focus only on these needs, because if we're using this holistic lens to consider what people need over a period of 12 or 13 years, you can't really distinguish between earthquake needs and needs that have resulted from protracted conflict. They're one and the same. And even through some of these earthquake needs, this is where I also want to highlight this parallel reality we're facing right now, where, 12, 13 years in, it's time, early recovery, although it's late, it's time to start thinking about a lot of these recovery models. But now we've gone back to very basic, rudimentary services needing to be supported: food, water, shelter, health. So really, when you're trying to conceptualize ways for communities to recover and return to normalcy, you can't do that when there are still such dire humanitarian needs. And then to address some of the needs, particularly in Turkey, Qutaiba, and I'll certainly touch on some of the other implications for humanitarian aid workers in some of our next questions that were in Turkey simply because, you know, the Gaziantep hub, the Antakya hub was sort of the epicenter for humanitarian response for Northwest Syria. But looking at a different set of issues, you know, a lot of the ones, the communities, particularly Syrian refugees that were affected by the earthquake in the southeast of Turkey, were displaced from their homes, obviously. Multiple displacements coming from Syria, particularly those in Urfa or Hatay or Adiyaman. So many of them had found some semblance of stability or security over a series of years, but then again back to square one after losing their homes. For many of these people, they had completely lost loved ones, life savings. And I think this is also where, you know, 1 year later, we do see a shrinking space in the country. One example of this, for example, is the inflation rate in Turkey that continues to climb somewhere upwards of 65%. And obviously in the aftermath, the impact on the housing market, on the ability, particularly for Syrians, to be able to afford rent. Now, there has been some, and not to get too much into legislation and policy, some rental caps that have, you know, for people who reside in their homes not being able to pay more than 25% of that. But for people whose homes were completely destroyed, we're talking about 200 or 300% increases in rental prices. The space is shrinking. People simply can't afford that. And obviously, and just to conclude, this is also tied to civil documentation. Without a rental agreement, you can't renew your residency permit. Without a residency permit, you can't have a work permit. So we very quickly see all of the compounded effects related to living conditions. I want to stop there for now because I know we're going to tackle this from different angles later, but over.
Thank you so much, Amani. And I want to move, and I know it's not easy with the kind of like the base you've set, Amani, for the situation currently in Syria. It is definitely a grim one, and again, not only in Syria but also for those displaced communities in South and Southeast Turkey. Alex, I want to move to you. USAID has been on top of the response from day one for the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. It provided immediate necessary support for the White Helmets and other organizations leading that response. But 1 year on, what are beyond this immediate relief and support for the recovery process? What kind of initiatives or programs does USAID have to help those communities rebuild, restructure? As Amani mentioned, the economic factor is very important in the Syrian case today, with inflation really staggering within those communities, again, not only in Syria, but also in Turkey. So also, aside from reconstruction, what programs are in place to support some sort of economic development that help those communities maybe transition from the humanitarian emergency response to a more economic development model? And sorry, I know it's a lot to throw on your plate, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to your perspective on that.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. Let me start by just saying thank you to the Atlantic Council and to the White Helmets for hosting this important event. Among other things, I think it's really important that the world does not forget about the crisis in Syria, both the aftermath of the earthquake, but also the ongoing humanitarian crisis, which Amani spoke to many of the details of just how dire that is. The other thing I think is important is to acknowledge just the lives that were lost in both Turkey and in Syria, including among many of the humanitarian organizations responding. So the heroism of the organizations that responded to this earthquake is all the more so because many staff were directly affected. They lost family members. Organizations lost their own staffs. So you know, that's part of the context. And then another part of the context, as we've already discussed, is just the ongoing crisis, which in Syria just means when the earthquake hit, there was already a tremendous degree of vulnerability from years of humanitarian crisis and humanitarian need and damage to infrastructure. So with all those things in mind, just a few brief words on how we responded. We deployed a DART within hours to Turkey to manage the response, both for Turkey and for Syria. In Turkey, we engaged in urban search and rescue with a large team of search and rescue specialists. For Syria, we had a team in Turkey already to manage our aid program. They were incorporated into this big response team, and we added capacity to that team to rapidly support partners that we already had in Syria responding to the existing crisis. So our approach for Syria right away was to quickly pivot the aid programs that we had ongoing to respond to the earthquake. Now, looking down the road a little bit in terms of where things are going and long-term need. First of all, I think for us to talk about reconstruction, really there needs to be irreversible political progress as a necessary and vital condition for reconstruction. And unfortunately, we haven't seen progress on that front. In any country in the world, when there's a crisis, for sustainable reconstruction, you need good governance and you need the absence of conflict. In the video that we saw at the beginning for the White Helmets, you saw the jets bombarding northwest Syria. That limits the possibility for reconstruction. So for us to support reconstruction in Syria, we need to see irreversible progress towards a political solution that aligns with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. But I do want to stress that we remain committed in Syria to meeting the urgent humanitarian needs. In response to the earthquake, we supported the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and 13 NGOs to provide emergency food and nutrition assistance, both within Syria as well as to refugees in Turkey. And they're continuing to provide support such as cash transfers of food, vouchers, emergency nutrition products, as well as distribution of wheat, flour, and yeast to bakeries to maintain a supply of daily bread. Beyond the relief program, we've been working in Syria for almost 14 years. And we continue to do that through more than 30 United Nations and non-governmental organization partners across a range of humanitarian sectors that includes food and nutrition. It includes healthcare, psychosocial support, shelter, access to safe water, and opportunities to earn an income. Our goal is always to give displaced families and other vulnerable people in humanitarian need, the ability to support themselves, to afford food and other basic necessities. The other thing I want to mention, just because we're here with the White Helmets, we are supporting them. They are a long-standing partner of ours. We provided additional support immediately after the earthquake, and our support helps some of their work, including emergency response, ambulance services, and health awareness services. So the funding that we provide to the White Helmets is really intended to support the work they're doing, which is truly heroic, both in terms of responding to the effects of the 2023 earthquake, but also to the continuing attacks by the Assad regime and Russian allies. And really, they continue to be instrumental to earthquake recovery efforts in northwest Syria, as you've already heard.
Thank you, Alex. Raed, I want to get back to you on something Alex mentioned here, which is the context of the background, that everything is happening in front of. As Alex mentioned, rightly, you can do reconstruction or work on like meaningful recovery while communities continue to be bombarded, by airplanes, by the Assad regime and their allies. Can you tell us more about that context? Kind of like you mentioned a little bit in your opening remarks. Can you tell us a little bit more about this background of the conflict itself, the conditions that the earthquake itself kind of like increased the already existing misery of the Syrian people to start with?
شكرا قتيبة وشكرا
Thank you very much, Kutaiba. Once again, thank you, Amani and Alex. Thank you for your interventions. What I would like to say here is that it is absolutely true that we can never start with any reconstruction unless we have a real and genuine political solution in Syria, because so far the international reports talk about the corruption committed by the Syrian regime through those early recovery programs and manipulating the humanitarian aid mechanisms and manipulating and exploiting them for political reasons. This is this is a real challenge that makes early recovery and the sustainability of supporting stability in Syria making it more difficult. There's no doubt that we all heard about humanitarian diplomacy, so to speak, or the diplomacy of the earthquake, as some Syrians call it, where the regime tried, or the Syrian regime tried to exploit this or take advantage of this earthquake and to achieve some political gains. And the United Nations gave the Syrian regime that on a gold plate, so to speak. We saw how Martin Griffith traveled to Damascus to meet with Bashar Assad and to open border crossings, and the continuity of the politicization of the humanitarian file by the United Nations is what actually putting the stick in the wheel, so to speak. We have been fighting, we have been struggling as Syrians in order to get this humanitarian aid resolution, and there are some practices that were talked about, and when we talked with the American humanitarian aids, the United Nations transferred this humanitarian file from the United Nations and put it in the hands of the Syrian regime, and this in itself creates an obstacle and creates a lot of challenges before we start with any early recovery attempts. This is the biggest humanitarian violation that can be committed in the against civilians. How on earth can we give the right or to have access to? How can you make the person who destroyed these people, who displaced these people, to have the final say in whether they can receive humanitarian aid or not? The regime that used chemical weapons to displace people out of Aleppo and Daraa, it is now Bashar Assad who has to allow or not allow whether humanitarian aid should be delivered to the Syrians or not. This politicization of the process of the humanitarian issues in Syria is the main thing that contributed to creating the problems and creating obstacles in Syria. Let me take the opportunity here to thank the support countries, the USA, the CDO, and other partners who have always been standing and standing with us and supporting us, supporting the White House from day number one following the earthquake, and even at specific and important and critical points when the United Nations was just observing from far away, not sending even one person to help in the rescue operations. And although 70% of the rescue teams were in Turkey, but not one single rescue team arrived in northwest Syria to help save Syrians from under the rubble. The White Helmet, in cooperation with other Syrian civil society organizations and with the grassroots organizations and private organizations, created a popular front, so to speak, to create a body that could do all it was able to do to save as many Syrians as possible. This is how people came together. This is how people like gave an example of solidarity when the United Nations were just watching. So this gives us, this disappoints us as Syrians. This is such a huge disappointment for all Syrians, and we always talk about that, and we confirm that the humanitarian aid should not be politicized. We are worried, unfortunately, about the information that's been leaked recently about the deal that talks about, or the deal between Martin Griffith and Bashar Assad, where the opening of a specialized office for early recovery to open in Syria and to be in Damascus. If this turns out to be true, if this news turns out to be true, this is going to be such a huge disappointment for Syrians, because we have been talking about early recovery for years and years that are being politicized in a systematic manner, just as Bashar Assad did a year ago by putting a picture, his picture, at the water station in Aleppo, and he opened this station in spite of the fact that this was rehabilitated by funding from the European Union in the framework of early recovery projects. We have to work hard, not only to provide humanitarian response and to work with other organizations to do that. Other organizations, actually the United Nations forces us to work in a different manner so that we show the image to the international community, to show the world what we are doing. And as I said, we can spare these efforts by increasing the efficiency of the response that is provided by the Syrian organizations. The United Nations always forces us, so to speak, to think about advocacy campaigns and other alternatives that could have been sorted out by the United Nations with simple resolutions from the United Nations that would make the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Syrians easily, and that can guarantee the transparency in the delivery of such aid to Syrians wherever they are in Syria.
So, Raed, between, not having the ability to fund reconstruction projects because the Assad regime is continuously bombarding those projects, and between the EU, for example, last year in their Brussels conference, have been focusing on pushing for early recovery projects, especially in energy. What do you think? And also between the fact that a political transition or a political resolution is unlikely to happen in any time in the near future, what are examples of projects that could be done that help in that recovery process that international donors like the United States governments and other governments can actually help support, but without risking, wasting taxpayers' money on projects that would be destroyed on the second day by Iranians and Russians, by working on the ground? And like the White Helmets is one of the biggest organizations existing on the ground in Northwest Syria. What are some examples of projects that could help in that recovery while mitigating that risk of wasting taxpayers' money?
يعني أولا موضوع حماية المدنيين أو
Well,
حماية
first of all, the issue of protecting civil facilities and the civilians, this is something that is not related to a humanitarian organization. How can we protect these projects, and can we do that? We can create such projects by creating safe zones. Safe zones can be protected by the Syrians themselves, or maybe actually the Syrians have been asking for specifying safe zones for over a decade now. As we mentioned again and again, for example, like 2 water stations were set up in North Syria. However, Russia simply bombed these 2 water stations that were set up and installed in northwest of Syria. So, do we just sit down and watch that? Do we not rehabilitate those stations because we're worried that they will be bombarded again, that they will be bombed again? No, we can't sit and watch them. Syrians want to live, and we have to continue and rebuild and rehabilitate these projects. We have to create mechanisms. As a Syrian organization, I say that we exert efforts. We try to find the mechanisms that help these projects to continue, however, to exist in safe areas and safe zones where they cannot be attacked. However, the enemy wants and targets on purpose these civilian projects and these civilian targets. We take all the measures necessary in order to create and implement projects in civil areas and safe zones in places we can never imagine that will be bombed and shelled. However, we are facing a criminal regime that uses all kinds of weapons against infrastructure, against civilian people. So, unfortunately, there is no way we can find a solution for this unless we have safe zones. Or we can just think of things as they are. We leave buildings that need rehabilitation. We need schools without rehabilitation simply because we worried that if we try and rehabilitate them and try to restore them, they will be bombed the next morning. So we can just leave them altogether. Is this logical? We need camps. All the camps are being bombed. So what do we do? Do we put the civilians or those displaced people, do we throw them into the air? Do we throw them into the sea? Wherever they go, they will be bombed. Unfortunately, we have no logical solutions. The only solution is to force the regime not to shell and bomb and bombard these civilians and these civilian projects. Is there a way? Is there anybody? Is there any organization that can prevent the regime from bombing these civilians? Who can do that? It's only the international community, the United Nations. So we will continue to work. Syrian civil society organizations will continue to do what they have to do, simply because we cannot stop. In the last 5 months, for example, 14 camps were subjected to bombing. So the camps are bombed, the hospitals are bombed, the schools are bombed, all infrastructure is bombed, electricity and water stations are bombed. So what do? Do we rehabilitate these projects, or do we just sit and watch them? We can never stop. The donors have to continue funding and helping these projects. Unfortunately, there's no other way. We have to confront these risks. We, as humanitarian works, we are doing our best. We have like 10% of our volunteering team, they were martyred. We lost them in response to these attacks. Is there any civil organization around the world that is ready to lose 10% of its employees, of its volunteers, to be lost, to be killed in such a place? Maybe in wars, maybe in armies, but not in a humanitarian organization. We are a humanitarian organization. We lost 10% of our volunteers who died as a result of the bombing in their responses because of the bombing and the targets, like double bombing, so to speak, where they would bomb a place, and when the civil and when we arrive the place to try and rescue the people, they bomb the place again so that they can kill as many of us as they can. They bombed our ambulance vehicles, killing a lot of volunteers inside these vehicles. And despite all of these risks, despite all of these circumstances, even though that Syria is now the most dangerous place on earth, we will continue to provide humanitarian and we will respond to the Syrian people in need, because we have come from this country and we are the ones who should protect them and support their resilience.
Thank you, Raed. We really know for like your courage and the courage of the teams of the White Helmets and their sacrifices. I want to move to Amani with kind of like a similar backdrop to what's happening in the conflict. There has been also many flaws within the humanitarian aid delivery systems into Syria. issues that immediately came up that actually hindered the response in the first few days after the earthquake was the issue of accessibility. And we've seen massive delays in aid reaching out those areas. To the extent not even recovery teams did not even reach areas of northwest Syria. International recovery teams did not even reach those areas until 4 or 5 days after the earthquake. But not only that, we've seen issues of, accessibility and cross-border access for UN humanitarian aid when roads to Bab el-Hawa were closed. We've seen reports coming up. There's a report from CSIS authored by Natasha Hall outlining the corruption hindering the aid delivery system through UN office in Damascus. What do you think are the main challenges that continue to hinder your response on the ground? How does it, and how does it really impact the ability to not only respond, but also hinder the ability for those communities to recover?
Thanks, Qutaiba. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start by just saying, and I touched on this as well, just in terms of access and security always being at the top of the list in terms of the operational environment and the risks organizations are facing on the ground. I think, like you touched, those first several days after the earthquake showed us just how much the access piece plays a part. And we know, looking back, that unfortunately for many, the consequences were so deadly, with so many lives lost, not because of generous funding still coming in from donors, but simply because only one entity was conducting search and rescue efforts and 0 member states came in to support efforts for inside of the northwest of the country, contrary to what we saw in the government of Syria controlled areas, contrary to what we saw in Turkey. I think just a moment ago you said it took several days, certainly not for search and rescue. No search and rescue missions were organized in the Northwest. That related more to trucks and some of the aid coming in, particularly from UN counterparts. And I think as tragic as that was, there was one small silver lining in all of this, and that was witnessing the incredible capacity of Syrians inside the country responding to the needs within the first 24 hours. I mean, this will always be a dark period in our history where we saw geopolitics hinder the ability to save lives. But what we did see was Syrians coming to the front lines, to the forefront, to provide aid, to provide those necessary services, as Raed touched on. It's an obligation. It's a moral imperative. I know as a health actor, what we saw in terms of particularly being able to bring in medical support from across the border. If you look at Turkey, there are around 33 different emergency medical teams that were set up from different countries, from the UAE, from Spain, from Jordan, from Indonesia, be it militaries or NGOs, deployed to Turkey, rapidly setting up. In terms of the Northwest, only 2 organizations were actually interested to provide, to deploy some of these teams. And out of these 2, none were actually able to get in. Part of that was because of risk appetite, and a lot of it was related to bureaucratic impediments, actually being able to move some of these teams and some of these services across the border. A lot of this access piece ties back, like I said, to the risk appetite. And at the end of the day, what's unfortunate is that communities that are affected by protracted conflict, particularly in the Northwest, this is where we see ambiguity relative to natural disasters, relative to other contexts where it seems more black and white, rather than being just able to objectively deliver humanitarian services. And this is really something that we need to learn how to navigate. We see more and more protracted conflict. Northwest Syria is not the only one in this particular predicament. We see more communities slipping into fragility, not only because of these conflicts, but because of all of the compounded shocks and stresses that continue to compound their vulnerability. The access piece also continues to be a factor in delivering services. We know the UN cross-border resolution was not renewed. It touched on this. And now access is contingent upon a consent model with the blessing of the government of Syria. The most recent one was obviously for a 6-month approval that was celebrated maybe by different counterparts, but in essence, this new model has created even more risks. This has created more instrumentalization of aid modalities, along with the concern around the ability to plan ahead. This is obviously tied to this frozen conflict narrative, stagnation of the political process, and really this normalization narrative. I know Raed touched on this quite a bit. We've seen this time and time again, but now it's become really, really pronounced. This has created even more uncertainty in terms of long-term programming. When short-term programming was already creating serious harm to community, at least from a service delivery standpoint, it's so challenging to plan 6 months at a time and always go back to contingency planning, particularly when sustainability is clearly an issue. And then just in terms of other challenges from an operational standpoint, I really want to take the opportunity to discuss protection of communities and of aid workers in particular. And Raed touched obviously a deep, deep part of my heart, which is just one of the most critical elements, is we are not doing enough to protect our aid workers. Syria is one of the most deadly places for humanitarian workers. Since October, we've seen more and more communities impacted, obviously compounded with 13 years of conflict now, and many more being displaced because of this escalation of hostilities. And we've seen these continue since that time each month, and essentially very limited efforts in terms of ceasefire, in terms of actually stopping these hostilities, given how vulnerable communities have become. In terms of protection of aid workers, I have to look back at the response in the aftermath of the earthquake and major shortcomings we saw related to duty of care in terms of how we protected our aid workers, both in Syria and in Turkey. We saw a huge discrepancy in terms of support to national NGOs relative to international actors. With the earthquake happening in February, in June, we were still debating if there was an imperative, a legal and moral imperative, to provide duty of care to Syrian NGO aid workers. And I'm sad to say that only, as of last June, only 2 UN agencies even agreed to provide duty of care to their Syrian NGO partners. This will always, in my mind, be a missed opportunity. And what I really hope moving forward is that there will be more of a commitment to protecting staff on the ground at the front lines of aid in other contexts. This isn't the first time, this surely won't be the last time. And this is really, really where we've seen the humanitarian sector struggle as a whole. Thanks, Qutaiba.
Thank you, Amani. Alex, I want to move to you and with maybe some hard questions. I'm getting some questions from folks following us on social media, especially on the response piece that Raed and Amani touched on, in terms of and specifically, I think folks are wondering if, as I mentioned, if the Assad regime is willing to continue to do this bombardment, if Assad regime is willing not to participate meaningfully in a political transition, then what do we do in between? It's understandable that, yes, we cannot provide reconstruction funding for the Assad regime as a prize for its 13 years war now on the Syrian people. And it's really tough to sell to our taxpayers that we are, to fund projects that will be destroyed the next day by the Assad regime bombardment. So what do we do meanwhile? What is how can we allow the Syrian people, at least in northwest Syria or across the north, continue to live their life, not being largely impacted by this policy, the punishment that the Assad regime has been driving in so many different ways, politically, humanitarianly, militarily, and other ways?
That is a very good question. I think the first thing I would say is that we cannot give up on holding the regime accountable to its obligations, and we really do have to continue to insist on a sustainable political solution. Really, that is the only long-term answer. But I also recognize that in the interim, there are people in need. The needs are growing. They were greatly exacerbated by this earthquake, but we see we had seen rising needs even independent of that, driven by not just violence now, but macroeconomic factors, COVID, et cetera. So these are things that we need to think about for the right now. The other challenge, frankly, is that we are in a world of increasing needs around the world, and both the U.S. and other donors are being stretched in ways that we never have before. So part of the answer is continued humanitarian aid. That remains vital. Part of the answer is looking at how humanitarian aid is provided. There are different ways of doing aid, some of which are more cost effective than others. Syria remains an incredibly resilient country. Syrians have been extremely just incredibly resourceful in the face of adversity. So for us and other donors, we try to focus on empowering them. And one of the things that we are doing is there are two pooled funds that we support. One is led by the UN, and then another one is led by the UK. And the intention of those are to support Syrian organizations, and I believe roughly 67 to 70% of disbursement from those multi-donor pooled funds go to Syrian organizations. The other thing is that in the absence of support to reconstruction, we can and do support what we call humanitarian early recovery. That terminology can sometimes get confusing, but from a humanitarian lens, the intention of early recovery is the same humanitarian outcomes, but a greater emphasis on empowering people to bring about those outcomes themselves. And that's good in two ways. It tends to be much more cost effective, and it's always better to empower people in their own solutions. So those can be things, and these are things that we support: livelihoods, vocational training, small scale repair and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure, such as water networks. For example, if there's a municipal water network, it's much cheaper to repair that than to rely on water tankering, and then bakery rehabilitation. So these are things in the humanitarian response plan and things that we as USAID support. And then the other thing is that in the face of just these worldwide resource challenges, we continue to advocate very strongly with other donors, including trying to bring new donors to the table to increase the overall level of support. That's an ongoing challenge. It's one of the reasons I'm here today and why I think this is important, because part of it is making sure that people remember what the depth of the crisis and needs in facing Syria.
And this is a good segue, Alex, to also my other question here. As you mentioned, there are so many emerging conflicts, especially in the region, not only in Syria now, which are about Syria, Gaza, Yemen is still ongoing, Sudan is increasingly volatile, the Horn of Africa. This is not only the responsibility of the U.S. government and U.S. aid, but also, so in that regard, in your message to other donors, not only in terms of what USAID is doing, what do you think should be the responsibility of other donors or regional governments in that sense, to contribute to that response? And have you been like in touch with like some of those donors again in the region or in Europe about those increasingly shared responsibilities?
Yeah, this is something that USAID and the overall U.S. government, our State Department, NSC, are continuously advocating with a range of donors around the world to increase funding or add additional funding. So it's not an easy task because we're all faced with the same challenges that the ones that you listed included. but it is something that we do, and I think one of the ways that we carry out that advocacy, besides just making sure that people understand the nature of the needs and the reasons behind them, is also to help donors, new donors especially, understand the humanitarian system and how to engage with it and how to be confident that resources are well spent. But just to give you a statistic about what we're dealing with as USAID, so last year we provided roughly $10 billion for humanitarian assistance around the world. This year, because of budgetary constraints, we expect that to be about $3 billion less. So that's the reality that we're facing in the context of these rising global needs.
Thank you, Alex. I want to like shift a little bit, and this is my question to the three of you as speakers. Maybe we can start with Raed, Amani, and then Alex. We've listed a lot of the challenges that are happening. We've listed the context of what has been ongoing. As I mentioned, the backdrop of the impact of this earthquake, but also as Raed mentioned, the 13 years ongoing earthquake that hit Syrians since 2011. And I would like each one of you to share one recovery priority that communities on the ground need at this point, but also one lesson learned from the earthquake itself and the response to it. As local actors responding directly on the ground, but also as USAID as an international actor looking at this from a more macro level. I'll start with you, Raed, move to Amani, and then Alex.
There is no doubt that priorities when it comes to recovery are many in Syria in particular. However, in the White Helmets, we identified as a priority the building or initiating projects to rehabilitate the infrastructure. Why? Because we believe that the infrastructure is the most important element for any community to continue to go by. Because when we rehabilitated road networks that do not have any international funding, but we did that from individual donation. Why did we rehabilitate those networks of roads? When we opened the way, when we paved the way of Afrin to Kafar Jannah and the third bridge, for example, an ambulance vehicle from Afrin to Assas would take more than 40 minutes to arrive at a place. After this road has been rehabilitated, it now takes the vehicle 26 to 28 minutes. These 10 to 12 minutes are very important for a person's life when they are inside an ambulance vehicle. So we thought that rebuilding the infrastructure contribute to saving the lives of people. And this is a new idea that is not related to reconstruction, but it is more related to saving lives. As we all saw, the issue of the cancer patients in northwest Syria in the aftermath of the earthquake. After the earthquake destroyed the welcome center or the reception center in east of Turkey, in Hatay and other places in Gaziantep. So those cancer patients had no place to go to, and some people, actually a lot of people did. So we worked with different organizations and different institutions to build and rehabilitate and open cancer, like such facilities to deal with cancer patients that can be opened by the end, like towards the end of 2024 and at the beginning of 2025. So I believe that when we focus our like early recovery projects to address the infrastructure problem. When we rebuild and rehabilitate the infrastructure in a community, that means we are able to serve all the civilians in that specific area. But when we talk about other specific projects or minor projects, that means the number of beneficiaries will be more limited and will be less. So I believe the priority here in early recovery is to think about rehabilitating the infrastructure in northwest Syria. Now, speaking of lessons learned from the earthquake and the response to the earthquake, I could say that the number one lesson learned is that people thought that Syrians, or different people thought that Syrians could never work together. This was a given. This was something that everybody thought. Like, why don't Syrians work with each other? Why aren't Syrians good at working with each other collectively? This earthquake gave the international community an answer that Syrians, when they have to, can work together, and because they believe in collective work, and that we as Syrians can never succeed unless we work together, hand in hand. So we all thank and we're all so grateful to everybody to the White Helmets for their response to the earthquake. As a member of the White Helmets, I take pride in that, so to speak. However, the reality shows that the White Helmet would have never succeeded in its response had not the other organizations and other civil society organizations and private companies made it possible for the White Helmets to use their facilities and put everything under their disposal. This is why the White Helmets were able to go forward and lead and take a leading role. But again, had it not been for the support of the other society organizations and other communities and other bodies and individuals, the White Helmets would not have gone so far and would not have achieved that much. Why? Because on the same day, or actually the day prior to the earthquake, on the 5th of February, and I might have mentioned this before, I was in a meeting, in a senior meeting in a White Helmets, and we were talking about what operations we were going to stop and about what projects we were going to suspend and what ambulance vehicles that we were going to put out of service because we had no funding to buy fuel for those vehicles. Since November 2022, we were not able to buy any fuel. From that month, from 2022, we were not able to buy any spare parts, and we still have the minutes of that meeting on the 5th of February. We finished the meeting, and I left the office for the executive board in Turkey after we discussed how we were going to stop some of the projects because of lack of funding. Exactly the following day, the earthquake hit. We decided to respond with all our full power, but I made a call for help 8 a.m. in the morning saying that we have diesel. So a lot of organizations respond, from the individuals, from the private companies, from all over the world. There was response from all over the world, even from our international partners from the USA. And this trust and this confidence, the USA called that we are ready to provide all the help you want. Lord Ahmed from the foreign ministry, said that they were ready to help. From the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from Qatar, from other European countries, they said we are ready to provide all the help. Buy the diesel, and we will pay you for that. And the people themselves, the civilians themselves, made donations, individual donations. And this is why we started buying diesel, buying fuel, and buying spare parts without having direct money. We did not have the money to support that. They started providing us with that money, and we have been able to overcome that ordeal in the best way possible, given what we had available to in our hands. Why? Because we were able to work together collectively, because we have been able to work as one group, and I can call that a heroism, so to speak. So this was one of the most important lessons. And then we thought about how we could develop our cooperation and collaboration. And this is why we met with, and agreed with SAMS and the Syrian Forum, and we started implementing multiple projects inside of Syria. And we also announced another coalition with a mean organization that we have been working with them on implementing a number of projects. And then we started creating collaboration mechanisms with those institutions and those partners so that we can mitigate the cost of implementing projects and making more quality projects with that are more cost effective. So those are the priorities and those are the lessons learned that we have, or that I can share with you following the earthquake. But most importantly, I can say that we had some gaps in the white helmets. We have been able to bridge these gaps. We have been able to rebuild the capacities of the white helmets in certain areas so that they're more able and more powerful to respond to such disasters. God forbid, however, we need to be almost on the alert, well prepared to respond in the best way possible, given what is available in our hands.
Thank you so much, Raed. Amani, to you, one priority and one lesson learned.
Well, that's an impossible question. I'm not just going to choose one, so I'm not going to follow instructions. Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo so much of what Raed just talked about, but maybe just from a physical standpoint, certainly, I think shelter and infrastructure has to be prioritized, simply because if people are displaced and not able to have this dignified shelter that we keep talking about, which still has not come into fruition, some of these solutions. This ultimately, and I say this as a public health practitioner as well, impacts the rest of their safety and well-being and opens up a slew of protection issues, particularly for women and children in terms of exposure to sexual violence, of course, from a health standpoint. But also in terms of the bigger picture, just thinking about education, of course. This is often the first thing that's deprioritized when you have all of these basic needs lacking funding right now. And for the health sector in particular, you know, so many different health system strengthening activities and initiatives were in place before the earthquake. Now we're back to the basics in terms of conducting different prioritization exercises, where so many different health facilities, particularly for this upcoming year, especially maternity and children's facilities, so especially hospitals and clinics that serve women and children, are or will be out of service. And Raed touched on a very critical point, which was roads and infrastructure. Seconds and minutes mean life and death in terms of getting people to these facilities. So when we put more facilities out of service due to lack of funding, or other issues, you know, we're compromising the ability to get these people to these facilities and provide life-saving aid. In terms of that investment in early recovery, like I emphasized earlier, you really can't do that when the funding channeled for humanitarian activities for so long now is decreasing, and we don't have another source of funding for early recovery. We really need to think about how we can pivot when there's this shortage of resources, whether, and I know Alex touched on, you know, certain reconstruction efforts, you know, are not possible in the absence of political solutions, but there certainly are different resources we need to tap into to not only reinstate some of these early recovery activities that were already in place, they might have been called something different, but also to continue right now, certainly because we're at this impasse. In terms of lessons learned, obviously there are many. I touched on this earlier, but I think the first is recognizing the incredible capacity of aid workers on the ground in the aftermath and being able to document these efforts. For me, this response really epitomized localization and the need to ensure local organizations, first responders, aid workers in any context on the ground are, one, equipped with the knowledge, the tools, and the resources to respond. They're the first ones there They're responding when communities have been left behind. And so we need to invest in this beyond simply a localization aspiration, as I've often heard it called. We have to make this a reality, especially given the need for the sector to become more efficient with its resources. Alex painted a very grim picture globally. Funding is down, and we need to think about ways to become more efficient and effective with our resources. Essentially, do more with less. And we have to invest in the workforce on the ground that's carrying these efforts, whether it's doctors, it's nurses, it's social workers, it's midwives, it's engineers. And then really the other lesson learned is to capitalize on the shortcomings that we saw in the aftermath of the earthquake, working towards clear policies even for things like duty of care, for crisis management. Like I said earlier, duty of care was a missed opportunity in this situation. And beyond just Syria, we need to address this in terms of a harmonized practice when we think at the global level, to account for natural disasters, to account for different emergencies, particularly when such a large part of the humanitarian community is equally affected. Obviously, as a public health person, I have to emphasize the mental health aspect of this. Oftentimes when people think of duty of care, they think of danger pay, they think of some form of financial compensation. But support in terms of mental health for traumatized aid workers was seriously lacking in this response. We had staff who buried their families and came back to work that same day. There needs to be more investment in this. I know that's hard in the Northwest particularly. You have 2 psychiatrists serving this region, serving a population of nearly 5 million people. But this is where we have to continue programs that have filled this gap. One program quite literally called the Mental Health Gap Action Program, training other healthcare workers on this. This needs to be prioritized, particularly because of the protracted conflict and the trauma imposed not only on the communities, but aid workers, which are of the community itself. And then just in terms of crisis management, there have been discussions around creating a more centralized body to respond, particularly in areas where there are non-state authorities. So this translates to broader search and rescue efforts. For example, this could be an equivalent of a FEMA or an AFAD, if you will, in terms of disaster management. But the emphasis needs to be on communities themselves being prepared as well. And then maybe just to provide one last reflection, Qutaiba, related to this question, I think, related to the politicization of aid, related to, just in terms of how we can maybe differently conceptualize recovery priorities. We need to destigmatize humanitarian aid for conflict-affected communities. I think the earthquake exposed very clear gaps in response and even the perception of communities in these settings. This stunted the response, and it continues to stunt the ability to effectively deliver aid in conflict. To be honest, I think globally, we still don't know how to respond to conflicts. We especially don't know how to respond to protracted conflicts. We need to be able to navigate these realities objectively, efficiently, and rapidly. This is the state of the world right now, and to be honest, we need to shift how we respond in these settings. Over.
Thank you, Amani. Last but not least, Alex.
Sure. So I'll talk about, I'll fold the priorities and lessons learned into one, just with three thoughts I have to share. The first one is just humanitarian access remains absolutely vital in Syria. We now have this consent-based model for Bab al-Hawa. I understand the 2 other crossings, Bab al-Salam and Bab al-Rai, just got renewed over the weekend on the consent-based model again, but for 3 months. So this is, I would say, this is untenable. The short term of these renewals, the fact that without a UN Security Council resolution, it's inherently tenuous. Even the resolutions were tenuous because they were subject to veto. But at least there's more of a framework underpinning them. So I would really advocate for a longer term answer on those access challenges. And beyond that, there's also what we've already talked about, just the incredible difficulty that that we saw with getting in for search and rescue workers. As I think Amani said, no other search and rescue teams were able to get in. The white helmets were the only ones there, and I think that's because they were there already. And I think that we need to continue to look at that. Why could nobody get in? That led to real tragic loss of life that could have been avoided had search and rescue teams been able to access northwest Syria. And then, the other one is building on partner capacity. So local organizations made up of Syrians in Syria are absolutely critical. This is true anywhere in the world that the people affected by disasters are the first responders, and building their capacity is absolutely critical to ensuring good outcomes. I think, though, in Syria, with the access challenges, that's even more important. So USAID worldwide supports localization. It's a policy of ours that we're driving towards. And in Syria, it is something that we are focused on even more. I mentioned the 2 pooled funds that we're supporting, but we also build capacity building for local partners into the awards that we fund. And then I would just conclude by saying again that really humanitarian assistance cannot be the long-term answer. Humanitarian assistance is never really the long-term answer. There has to be a sustainable political solution that would allow for real reconstruction to begin, because Syrians have the capacity to help themselves and rebuild their country, but they need that context of a sustainable political solution, including respect for humanitarian needs and human rights by the Syrian regime. So that will be absolutely critical.
Thank you, Alex. I want to take a couple of questions we got from the audience. One, I think for you, Amani, which you touched upon a little bit. Someone is asking, how are Syrian organizations responding to the decrease in humanitarian funding, and how are your services being impacted?
Sure. Do you want me to go ahead and answer that, or did you want to?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think in essence, to say it in one sentence, we're robbing Paul to pay Peter. If there's one way I can say it, essentially, it's, and I touched on this related to specifically healthcare facilities and different services, particularly targeting women and children. We're seeing major shortages related to funding for sexual and reproductive health activities, for women and girls safe spaces that respond to sexual violence. A lot of what's happening right now are prioritization exercises, these dreadful exercises, where you have to really target the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. It's a painful process, and certainly, and I touched on this with other sectors as well, just in terms of food cuts. A lot of these implications that are tied together, from a public health standpoint, is really, it's going to be a bleak year, to be honest. And what we really need to do, and Raed touched on this as well, is a lot of organizations are coming together to understand and to think about how we can be more efficient with our resources, how we can keep administrative costs low, how we can channel the majority of our funding towards those implementation efforts. So that's just sort of in a nutshell. I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to touch on that a bit.
Thank you. I don't know, Raed, if you want to add to that as well. On how the White Helmets is able to respond with the reduction of funding hitting Syrian humanitarian actors.
لا شك يعني أن الخفض في التمويل هو
There is no doubt that less funding creates more challenges and more obstacles for Syrian organizations in general and for the White Helmets in particular. However, let me say that reduction reduction of funding is going to have disastrous results or disastrous consequences. Not only the WFP that decreased like 60 to 80% of what they have been providing, for example, and in northwest Syria, they are just providing, or the WFP only provides food aid, not other agricultural projects in other parts in Syria. And as I mentioned before, protection is also another important issue. Supporting education also is, as Amani has just mentioned, one of the main priorities that is deprioritized, so to speak, when the funding goes down is education. And usually those who are most affected by wars and by crises are children. And this is why we need to take good care of children and rehabilitate them so that we can make progress in the future and advance in the future. How to deal with this problem with less funding? I believe we have to find alternative and parallel ways to that. Yes, it is true that there are pool funds that are supporting, there are individual donations, and there are charities, international charities that are also helping. We have to think in different ways, and we have to do what we can. We try to develop our own plans in order to address the lack of funding, or but sometimes you have we get shocked as a result of the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Gaza that has a direct impact on funding that was targeted towards Syria and Syrian projects. So dealing with this kind of challenge is very difficult, but at the same time, this is something that we have to grin and bear it, so to speak. So we have to think always about the priorities and think about life-saving aid, and after that, aid that can help to rehabilitate the communities and make them get by, create some work opportunities, for example, some Syrians, so that we stop being dependent on humanitarian aid and become more independent as much as we can.
And finally, this is a good segue because we have another question, Raed, on the impact of the war in Gaza, if any, on the conflict in Syria. Beyond the issue of funding, have you seen any, or if you want to expand on that as well, have you seen any other impact? I guess considering the close geographical distance to what's happening in Gaza. But I don't know if there are any other factors that you've seen that impacted the response in Syria.
يعني لا شك أن موضوع التمويل
Well, of course, funding is a secondary issue here. The biggest impact, however, is that the Syrian regime has also taken advantage of the situation, the crisis in Gaza, and has so far conducted more than 1,350 attacks or raids on northwest Syria. So how is this affecting us? How is this impacting us? It's impacting us that there was no media outlet, no Arabic, no Arab media, but there was no media that mentioned that 31 schools were targeted, 14 hospitals, or maybe 12 markets, some places or some offices of the Syrian civil defense. Over 3 months, nobody has taken heed of that. And the biggest humanitarian disaster is what's happening in Gaza, and this is affecting us all. But because of that, nobody seems to have time to talk about what's happening in northwest Syria and the attacks against the civilians and the civilian facilities. Now we're beginning to hear, or actually, there is a trend that gives more support to the Iranians, unfortunately, and in the continuity in achieving justice and accountability by Syrians against the Iranian militias that have committed a lot of violations against the Syrian people and the Syrian communities, with the rape and the torture and all kinds of violations over more than 12 years by Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias and the Pakistani militias and the Afghani militias and other Iran-related and Iranian-backed militias like the Revolutionary Guard, etc. So I believe these are two impacts of what is happening in Syria, and we should never forget that the regime always takes advantage of any crisis or any event that takes place around the world, because the regime knows for sure that nobody will pay attention to Syria. But prior to that, even Syria has had the same impact on Gaza, because the Israelis do exactly what the Syrian regime does, for example, and nobody has held anybody accountable. And there are a lot of Syrian officers who mentioned that these are the strategies of Assad in Syria. So if you want to hold us accountable, go and hold Bashar Assad accountable first. This is why impunity is a very serious issue. When people see that Assad has done so much and is still where he is, other people will be encouraged to commit crimes because they don't care anymore, seeing that Assad has been doing all those criminal attacks for so long, and he's still leading Syria as a president. Nobody has touched him. Of course, the Israelis are doing the same. Putin is doing the same in others. For example, we're worried about about the Gazans in the city of Rafah. 1.5 million Gazans or more are now on the border. We pray for them that they will be fine. We hope. We will say that this is a mutual impact. What is affecting us, what is affecting our brothers and brethren in Gaza is affecting us here, and we take the protection of civilians as a priority anywhere in the world.
Thank you so much, Raed. It's unfortunate that we're running out of time, but it was really great talking to you. I think the priorities that should be highlighted from what you mentioned: rehabilitation, shelter infrastructure, investment in early recovery, and more sustainable humanitarian access for better planning. And I hope we have those who are listening can carry some lessons on how we can, in looking at the reasons why we didn't have, accessibility in the first days after the earthquake, so this is not repeated in the future. More focus on mental health and the duty of care, and the ability to document efforts. And hopefully we can also learn more importantly, from how Syrians were able to work together to respond to this earthquake in the absence of international support. I want to thank you so much, Raed Saleh, the head of the White Helmet Syria Civil Defense, Alex Mahoney, the division chief at the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, and Dr. Amani Qaddour, the executive director for Syria Relief and Development. I want to thank our audience, and I want to apologize for not able to take all of the questions they send in. But please follow our speakers on social media, follow their engagements, their papers and research. But also follow Syria Project on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Follow the Atlantic Council to see what other events are coming up. Thank you all, and hope you have a great day.